My name is Lark. It all started the moment my mother grabbed my hand, her fingers cold and trembling, and whispered, "I'm afraid of your sister-in-law." The way she said it, barely audible, sent a shiver down my spine, and I instantly knew that these weren't just idle words. Something had been brewing, quietly, invisibly, in the corners of our family life, and now it was spilling into the open. That day, when I finally saw what she was holding in her hand, I didn't understand at first. It looked ordinary, like any other piece of paper, yet the weight it carried was enormous. By the time I drove into my mother's driveway, the November sky had settled into that muted gray, the kind that makes the world feel heavy, almost suffocating, as though even the clouds themselves were conspiring in silence. The house outside hadn't changed much, the same faded blue shutters, the cracked front step I'd tripped over countless times as a teenager. But as I turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, a quiet unease crept over me. It wasn't the cold that made my skin prickle. It was the type of silence that sits in a house that once echoed with laughter, arguments, and footsteps, now only reverberating with memories that seemed trapped between the walls. I stepped out slowly, gripping my small weekend bag, pausing for a breath on the porch before knocking, even though I had a key. Old habits die hard. The door swung open before I could raise my hand. "Oh, you're early," Callista said, her tone light, her smile perfectly practiced, hiding something I couldn't yet name. "Traffic was light," I said, stepping inside. The warmth from the heater hit me immediately, but it did nothing to thaw the chill in my chest. The living room was pristine, too neat, as if arranged for guests rather than lived in. Callista wore her usual neutral-tone cardigan, pearl studs, and her hair was flawless. One strand out of place would have been impossible. She didn't hug me. Instead, she stood there with that smug composure she always wore like a shield. "Mom's in the kitchen," she added, as though she needed to justify her presence. I didn't respond, only nodded, and walked past her, my boots barely making a sound against the polished wooden floor. In the kitchen, my mother, Marina, was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like a combination of onions, celery, and a heavier dish, maybe stuffing. But it wasn't the aroma that stopped me. It was her. My mother looked smaller, the sweater hanging loosely from her shoulders, her hair grown just long enough to seem untamed. She didn't seem to notice me enter, or maybe she did, pretending otherwise. "Mom," I said gently. Her eyes flickered for a brief second, a spark of recognition that quickly shuddered behind caution. Her smile was thin and forced. "Lark," she said softly. "You're early." "That's what Callista said," I replied, stepping closer and placing my bag down by the pantry door. "Need help?" I asked. She didn't answer, just stared at the stove for a moment longer than necessary. Then suddenly, she turned to me, her hand reaching out and gripping mine tightly. Her fingers were colder than I expected, not frail, but trembling, as if she had been holding something back for far too long. "I'm afraid of your sister-in-law," she whispered. At first, I thought I must have misheard her. Her voice was low, trembling at the edges, as if speaking aloud could summon some unseen danger. "What?" I asked, leaning closer, thinking perhaps she had been confused. But her eyes, sharp, focused, unmistakably scared, told me otherwise. "I'm afraid of Callista," she said again, her tone firmer, more urgent. I stayed silent, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. 4 years, she had defended Callista, praised her, let her manage the finances, medications, appointments, everything. Now, in a single whispered sentence, all that trust seemed to crumble. "What happened?" I asked carefully. She looked away, as if avoiding the answer. "Nothing. Just forget I said anything." Her grip loosened, and she turned back to the stove. "Forget I said anything." The words echoed in my mind like a slammed door. Before I could probe further, Callista's voice floated from the hallway. "Dinner's almost ready, Lark. Could you set the table?" I didn't answer. I moved toward the dining room, mind racing. Passing through the hallway, I noticed Ellis flipping through a stack of mail, barely acknowledging me. "Hey," he muttered. "Hey," I replied. He handed an envelope to Callista without looking. My heart stopped when I caught a glimpse of it. Durable power of attorney, it read in bold print. She smiled casually, holding it as if it were nothing. I swallowed hard, knowing in that instant that the small, ordinary envelope held the power to shift everything, and nothing would ever be the same. That night, after dinner, the house felt heavier than usual, a quiet tension hanging in the air like smoke that refuses to dissipate. The living room hummed faintly with the low volume of a Hallmark movie, but it didn't fill the space, it barely covered the silence. I moved to help my mother with the dishes, though my heart was racing, and every step I took felt like I was walking on thin glass. Her hands shook slightly as she washed the plates, the tremor subtle but undeniable. I noticed the way she kept glancing at the hallway, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. "Have you been sleeping okay?" I asked softly, careful not to startle her. She shrugged slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Some nights." "Do you want me to go over your medications tomorrow?" Her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary, a silent plea hidden in their depth. "No," she finally said, almost to herself. "Callista's got it." I felt a pang of frustration and anger. Of course she does. Every decision, every movement in this house seemed to pass through Callista's hands first, with careful calculation and absolute control. I tried to focus on small, normal tasks, stacking plates, rinsing glasses, but my mind kept replaying the earlier scene, the envelope, Callista's smile, the subtle dominance in her stance. It was like the house itself had become an instrument of their manipulation, every polished surface reflecting the quiet war being waged within these walls. I moved quietly to retrieve my mother's tablet from the side table, hoping to catch a glimpse of what communications she had been receiving. A new email caught my attention immediately, its subject line stark and unnerving. "Placement secured, Marina." I froze. The message was clinical, devoid of any emotion, written as if moving my mother to another home were nothing more than a logistical task. The sender, Callista Run, had carefully outlined a schedule and instructions, ensuring no one else in the family, me, Marina, even my mother herself, could interfere. My chest tightened as the reality of the situation set in. My mother was being maneuvered like a piece on a chessboard, every step of her life dictated by someone who posed as a caretaker but acted like a predator. I took multiple screenshots, saving every word, every instruction, knowing that these digital fragments were the only way to protect both my mother and myself. I placed the tablet down gently, careful not to make a sound. The faint ticking of the antique clock in the hallway, the distant clink of a spoon in the kitchen, and the quiet hum of the heating system created a rhythm that only emphasized the eerie stillness of the house. By midday, Ellis had set up his laptop at the dining room table, and Callista was on speakerphone in the kitchen, discussing estate planning with someone she referred to as the counselor. I moved carefully between them, blending into the background, observing every gesture, every word, every tiny sign that revealed intent. At one point, Ellis left his laptop open when he stepped away. My pulse quickened as I glanced at the screen. A browser window was open, displaying a loan application for a commercial property refinance. Borrower, Ellis Wren. Guarantor, Marina Coyle. Attached was a digital signature form, marked with Callista's name, not Ellis's, and a checked box indicating durable power of attorney. I froze, realizing they were leveraging my mother's home, using her as collateral without her consent. My mind raced, but I stayed calm, methodically taking screenshots and securing evidence. I closed the laptop as Ellis returned, pretending to be preoccupied with my own small tasks. The weight of the house pressed in around me, the polished floors, the artificial cheer, the distant laughter, all a facade hiding a plan I was only beginning to unravel. That night, I lay in my old bed, staring at the faded lilac wallpaper I had hated as a teenager. The cracks above the window, jagged and spidering, looked like a map of a trapped life I now realized I had been quietly monitoring all these years. I made a promise to myself that night. No longer would I be invisible. No longer would I allow manipulation to go unchecked. I would fight, carefully, quietly, and strategically. And tomorrow, the game would begin. The next morning, I woke to the same muted gray light filtering through the blinds, the chill in the room a constant reminder of the tension that had taken residence in our home. Breakfast was mechanical, almost ritualistic. Callista sat at the head of the table with a perfectly symmetrical smile, Ellis beside her scrolling on his phone, and my mother stirring her tea with a hand that trembled more than I had noticed yesterday. I poured myself a cup, letting the steam rise to my face, trying to anchor myself to something normal. But normal no longer existed. I had spent the night strategizing, mentally tracing every move Callista and Ellis had made and what they might do next. My mind felt like a chessboard, each piece in its place, some hidden, some obvious, and the threats lurking in the shadows. I decided today I would gather every scrap of evidence, no matter how insignificant it seemed. First, the financial records. I moved toward the study, where Callista had left a folder carelessly open on the desk. My pulse quickened. I picked it up, flipping through documents that detailed loans, property transfers, and investments, all under my mother's name, signed, notarized, and manipulated in a way that screamed calculation. My hand shook slightly as I skimmed the legal jargon, each line a silent scream of betrayal. How had she convinced my mother to allow this? Or worse, had she manipulated it without her knowledge? The deeper I read, the clearer it became. My mother had been trapped in a carefully constructed web, each strand designed to isolate her and control her. I took photos of everything, my phone acting as both witness and weapon. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother peeking from the kitchen doorway, her expression conflicted, a mix of fear, guilt, and hope. She didn't speak, only nodded slightly, silently acknowledging that I had understood the gravity of the situation. That was all she could give me, her trust, in the form of quiet compliance. Next, I turned my attention to the digital trail. Emails, texts, and browser histories revealed a meticulous orchestration of my mother's finances and social interactions. Callista had created a narrative that made my mother dependent, fearful, and pliable. The counselor, the emails, the phone calls, all part of a psychological labyrinth that I had to navigate without alerting them. Every move I made required careful calculation. One false step, and everything could collapse, leaving my mother even more vulnerable. Hours passed, each moment heightening my awareness, sharpening my resolve. By afternoon, I had assembled enough material to confront, to question, or at the very least to protect. Yet, the problem remained. Callista was clever, manipulative, and dangerous in a way that didn't scream obvious threat but radiated subtle dominance and control. I knew that direct confrontation could backfire. Instead, I began formulating a plan. I would document, observe, and wait for the right moment to strike, ensuring that every action I took strengthened my position. By evening, I had prepared a digital folder, encrypted and hidden, containing copies of all the critical documents, emails, and photos. It was my insurance, my silent arsenal. I retreated to my room, the weight of responsibility pressing down, yet feeling a strange empowerment. For the first time in months, I realized I wasn't entirely powerless. There was a path forward, however treacherous, and I was ready to walk it. But as the house fell into the quiet lull of evening, a new unease began to creep in. Callista was not idle. Her movements were subtle but deliberate. A slightly sharper tone here, a fleeting glance there, each gesture a reminder that she was always watching, always assessing. I understood that our game had begun, a battle fought not with violence but with intelligence, patience, and nerves of steel. And in the back of my mind, one thought persisted relentlessly: she had underestimated me. And that, as I would soon prove, was her greatest mistake. The following morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Every detail of yesterday's investigation replayed in my mind, shaping a plan that balanced precision with patience. I moved through the house like a shadow, unnoticed but observant, careful to register Callista's every movement. Breakfast was quiet, almost too quiet. Callista's eyes flickered toward me occasionally, the smallest hint of suspicion crossing her otherwise flawless composure. I smiled politely, hiding the storm of awareness brewing within me. My first step was subtle, almost imperceptible. I left a small, carefully placed folder on the study desk, in a spot where Callista would notice it when she returned. The folder contained falsified financial reports I had created overnight, designed to make her believe that one of her key manipulations had been detected and documented. It was a test, a probe, to see how she would react. Within the hour, I noticed her approach, deliberate, careful, yet with that characteristic edge of authority she wielded like a weapon. She picked up the folder, scanned it quickly, and her hand trembled slightly. I had caught it, a micro-expression, but enough. Her mind was working, calculating, adjusting to the possibility that someone had infiltrated her carefully curated control. I remained calm, sipping my coffee, pretending to read an article on my phone, while my mind catalogued every movement, every subtle twitch, every hesitation. Then came the first confirmation that my plan was working. Callista's tone, usually polished and measured, became slightly sharper, almost defensive, when she spoke to Ellis about a financial discrepancy I had planted. "Are you sure these numbers are correct?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper but laden with tension. Ellis, confused, muttered something about checking the entries again. I suppressed a smile, knowing that the seed had been planted. That small tremor in her composure, that momentary uncertainty, was the first crack. The rest of the day unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. I moved from room to room, observing, collecting, and documenting. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every misstep from Callista was logged in my mind, stored for the larger strategy one was assembling. By evening, I had more evidence than ever, inconsistencies in her financial manipulations, subtle signs of stress, and most importantly, proof that my mother's independence was being systematically eroded. I retreated to my room, heart pounding, adrenaline and purpose mixing into a singular resolve. My mother, sensing the shift, hesitated outside my door for a moment before speaking softly. "Are you really going to help me?" I nodded, a promise in my eyes, knowing that my actions today had already begun to alter the balance of power. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I realized something crucial. Callista had underestimated me completely, and every action I took from now on would exploit that oversight. The next day, the house seemed almost alive with anticipation, each room a silent witness to the subtle war unfolding within its walls. I moved carefully, noting Callista's every gesture, every glance, every calculated pause. Breakfast was unusually tense. The clinking of silverware against plates sounded louder, sharper, as if the house itself were amplifying the suspense. I noticed my mother's hands trembling slightly as she reached for her teacup, and a pang of anger and determination surged through me. She had been trapped too long, and I knew it was my responsibility to act decisively. I started with small, precise maneuvers, rearranging files so that critical documents were more visible, leaving a digital footprint that hinted someone was monitoring Callista's schemes. Every subtle action was intended to rattle her confidence, to make her question the security she so meticulously maintained. By late morning, Callista began to show signs of agitation. Her movements, once smooth and deliberate, became slightly erratic. She checked files multiple times, muttering under her breath, and even glanced toward my room with an intensity that betrayed her concern. I stayed calm, outwardly indifferent, all the while documenting every reaction. Then came the first opportunity for direct engagement. Callista had called my mother into the study, ostensibly to discuss a minor detail in the paperwork. I waited until the door closed before slipping into position, a small recorder in hand, ready to capture every word. The conversation unfolded exactly as I had anticipated: subtle intimidation, gentle persuasion, manipulation masked as guidance. I felt my stomach tighten as my mother spoke, hesitant but gradually asserting herself, encouraged by the presence of my silent support. Each sentence I recorded was a victory, tangible proof of the coercion my mother had endured, and the growing tension in Callista's tone was unmistakable. By afternoon, I had begun to execute the next phase of my strategy, spreading subtle misinformation designed to provoke errors in Callista's plans. Fictitious emails, fabricated financial discrepancies, and carefully orchestrated hints of external scrutiny were all part of a larger plan to destabilize her control. As the day progressed, her facade began to crack further. I noticed her sighing in frustration, her sharp gaze occasionally darting toward me as if suspecting something, but unable to pinpoint the source. I took careful notes, my mind analyzing every interaction, every word, every nuance, preparing for the moment when I would confront her directly. By evening, the house was thick with tension. The air seemed heavier, every sound amplified, Every glance weighted with suspicion. I retreated to my room once again, heart pounding, adrenaline surging, and a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in years washing over me. I knew that tomorrow, and the days following, would demand even more precision, patience, and courage. But for the first time, I felt that the balance of power was shifting. Callista had underestimated me entirely, and I was ready to exploit that mistake. The following morning, I woke with a heightened sense of purpose, a clarity that felt almost electric. I knew the next steps had to be bolder, more decisive. Subtlety had served its purpose, but now it was time to escalate. I moved through the house deliberately, observing Callista with careful precision, every gesture, every glance catalogued in my mind. She was tense, her movements sharper, her voice tinged with irritation when speaking to Ellis about minor matters. It was proof that my carefully orchestrated disruptions were working. I decided it was time to push further. First, I accessed the encrypted files I had hidden the previous day, ensuring they contained undeniable proof of her manipulations and coercion of my mother. Then, I created a scenario designed to make her panic. A false notice from a financial auditor, a brief email from a fabricated investigative agency, and subtle hints dropped around the house suggesting that someone was closely monitoring her actions. By late morning, the cracks began to widen. Callista, normally composed and cold, appeared flustered, her eyes darting nervously toward me as if she sensed my silent presence. She tried to maintain control, her voice clipped and authoritative, but the effort was futile. The tension in the house was palpable, each step she took heavy with uncertainty. I watched as she checked her papers repeatedly, muttering under her breath, her composure unraveling with every passing hour. My mother, encouraged by the subtle shift in power, finally spoke with a courage I had not seen in months. Her voice, trembling but firm, challenged a minor directive from Callista, a test I had anticipated. Callista hesitated, the imperceptible tremor in her eyes betraying the cracks I had been nurturing. I knew then that the balance of control was tilting, and the psychological advantage was now mine to exploit. By afternoon, I had begun coordinating small, indirect confrontations that further destabilized her. I spread minor discrepancies, exaggerated mistakes, and carefully orchestrated contradictions in her plans, all while remaining outwardly calm, polite, and seemingly uninvolved. Callista's reactions grew more erratic. I noticed her jaw tightening, fingers tapping impatiently, and eyes flickering toward me more frequently. She was desperate to understand who or what was undermining her, but she could not locate the source. I documented everything, my mind calculating the next steps, preparing for the moment when a direct confrontation would become inevitable. By evening, I had amassed a wealth of material, proof of coercion, evidence of manipulation, and the first real signs of psychological breakdown in my adversary. I retreated to my room, my heart racing, a strange exhilaration coursing through me. For the first time in months, I felt not just hope, but control. Callista had underestimated me, and every move I had made today ensured that her mistake would cost her dearly. Tomorrow would mark the next stage of the plan, and I was ready. The next morning, I felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve like never before. Every moment of the previous days had built to this point. Every subtle manipulation, every planted doubt, every silent observation had prepared me for the next stage, confrontation. I knew it could not be reckless. It had to be calculated, strategic, undeniable. I started by setting small traps, carefully designed to make Callista act impulsively. Files were slightly misplaced, emails subtly altered, and whispered hints of external scrutiny left strategically where she would see them. By mid-morning, her tension was tangible. She moved through the house like a caged animal, eyes darting, gestures sharp, voice taut with frustration. Even Ellis noticed and hesitated before speaking, uncertain of her mood. I watched, silent and composed, every micro-expression logged in my mind. My mother, emboldened by my presence, began asserting herself more, asking questions that subtly challenged Callista's authority. Callista tried to maintain control, but the cracks were widening rapidly. Then came the first real test, a document I had accidentally left on her desk. It contained incontrovertible evidence of her manipulations, carefully highlighted, so she could not ignore it. She froze when she saw it, fingers trembling as she adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing. I observed from a distance, my heart pounding, adrenaline sharp. Callista's mind raced visibly, trying to calculate the source of this exposure, her facade cracking further with every passing second. By afternoon, the tension reached a fever pitch. She confronted Ellis in a tone that was harsher than usual, her eyes flicking toward me repeatedly, suspicion and fear evident in her every gesture. My mother's newfound courage was also on display. She calmly and firmly questioned Callista about minor inconsistencies I had documented. Callista faltered, momentarily at a loss for words, then recovered with forced composure. I knew the moment for direct confrontation was near. In the evening, I prepared the room for the confrontation, documents laid out, recordings ready, every detail meticulously arranged. Callista entered, unaware of the impending exposure. Her eyes scanned the room, a flicker of unease passing briefly before she assumed her usual authoritative stance. I took a deep breath and began speaking, each word measured, deliberate, revealing the extent of her manipulations and the evidence I had gathered. Her reaction was immediate: shock, disbelief, anger, a subtle tremor betraying the fear she tried to hide. The house seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation unfolded, a psychological battle reaching its apex. My mother, seated beside me, finally looked at Callista with the respect and authority that had been denied for so long. The dynamic had shifted, the power was no longer hers alone. I remained calm, every sentence deliberate, every revelation timed for maximum impact. By the end of the evening, Callista's carefully constructed facade had begun to crumble, and I knew that the first decisive victory in this long and painful struggle had been achieved. The following morning, the house felt different, charged with a tension that had finally shifted in our favor. Callista, usually composed and commanding, moved cautiously, her previous arrogance replaced by a quiet unease. I watched her from a distance, noting every micro-expression, every hesitant step, every fleeting glance that betrayed her growing awareness of the new balance of power. My mother, on the other hand, walked with a newfound confidence, her posture straighter, her voice firmer, and her eyes brighter. The simple act of witnessing her regain control was profoundly emotional for me, a vindication of every calculated risk I had taken. I began the day with subtle gestures, offering assistance, guiding her through documents, ensuring she felt supported yet independent. Callista attempted her usual manipulations, but the effect was minimal. The tension in her tone, the slight tremor in her gestures, revealed her growing vulnerability. By mid-morning, I had gathered further evidence of her compromised control, documents and recordings that highlighted the inconsistencies and lies she had woven so tightly over the years. My mother's voice grew stronger as she confronted minor issues, no longer hesitant, no longer fearful, and I observed with a mixture of pride and relief. Callista's responses grew defensive, her authority waning, and her attempts to regain control increasingly transparent. By afternoon, I initiated the final phase of subtle exposure. I left key documents in strategic locations, allowing Callista to encounter them naturally, triggering responses that further undermined her credibility. Each reaction, recorded carefully, added to the growing evidence of her manipulation and deceit. My mother watched, her eyes wide with realization, as the full extent of Callista's control, and now her unraveling became apparent. The emotional weight of these moments was overwhelming. Years of suppressed fear and resentment finally found expression. I approached my mother, offering a hand, a gesture of solidarity and reassurance. She grasped it tightly, her eyes glistening with gratitude and emotion. We shared a silent acknowledgement. This was not just a victory of strategy, but a reclamation of dignity and autonomy long denied. By evening, the house had settled into a strange calm. Callista, though still present, had lost the dominance she once wielded so effortlessly. My mother's confidence had grown, her voice now firm and unshakable, her presence commanding respect rather than fear. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction and relief, knowing that our patience, strategy, and courage had brought us to this moment. The emotional bond strengthened, the lingering fear dissipated, and a new chapter began, one of empowerment, resilience, and reclaimed authority. And in that quiet, reflective evening, I realized that the battle had been as much about reclaiming identity and self-respect as it had been about exposing deceit, and that truth, patience, and determination could indeed shift the balance of power forever. The next few days unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each note bringing us closer to the inevitable resolution. Callista's attempts at regaining control became increasingly desperate, her composure fractured under the weight of undeniable evidence and mounting pressure. I observed her tactics unravel, noting how her once confident voice faltered in meetings, how her calculated gestures betrayed panic, and how her eyes, once cold and commanding, now darted anxiously from side to side. My mother, in contrast, had transformed completely. She moved through the house with a confidence that had been absent for years, her words deliberate, her demeanor assertive, and her presence commanding respect rather than fear. I continued my careful orchestration, subtly guiding interactions and ensuring that Callista's mistakes were highlighted naturally without the need for direct confrontation. By midweek, the tension reached its peak. A critical meeting, previously dominated by Callista's manipulations, became the stage for the final act. I had ensured that all necessary documents, recordings, and evidence were accessible, strategically placed to expose her mismanagement and coercion. The moment arrived. Callista, seated at the head of the table, attempted her usual dominance, but the subtle cues, the carefully planted evidence, and my mother's newfound assertiveness dismantled her authority piece by piece. Her reactions were immediate, defensive, frustrated, and increasingly erratic. Each attempted rebuttal only deepened the impression of instability, further cementing the narrative we had constructed over days. By the afternoon, the outcome was undeniable. Callista's influence, once unassailable, had crumbled, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. My mother addressed the room with clarity and authority, articulating facts, pointing out inconsistencies, and commanding attention effortlessly. I watched, a mixture of satisfaction and relief washing over me, as years of manipulation were methodically undone before my eyes. Callista's expression shifted from disbelief to resignation, and finally, a quiet acknowledgement of defeat. There was no dramatic outburst. Her power had simply dissipated, replaced by the stark reality of her exposed actions. By evening, the house settled into a calm I had not experienced in years. My mother and I shared a quiet moment, reflecting on the journey, the struggle, and the reclamation of dignity and autonomy. Callista remained, a presence diminished, her aura of control replaced by vulnerability and awareness of her mistakes. I realized then that the battle had not only been about exposing deception but about restoring balance, respect, and the right to self-determination. The final victory was not only strategic but profoundly emotional, a testament to patience, courage, and calculated resilience. And in that quiet triumph, I understood that truth, when wielded with precision and integrity, could irrevocably shift the course of power, forever altering the dynamics of control within the walls we had once felt imprisoned by. In the quiet aftermath, the house felt lighter, almost transformed, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of weeks and released it with our victory. Callista, though still present, no longer held sway. Her presence was muted, her gestures cautious, her voice lacking the commanding edge it once possessed. My mother moved freely now, her confidence palpable, her words carrying weight and authority, the very essence of dignity restored. I reflected on the journey, the meticulous planning, the calculated risks, and the emotional turbulence that had defined our path to this moment. It had not been easy. Every decision carried weight. Every move was a careful consideration of consequences, and every subtle action was designed to dismantle years of manipulation without igniting direct conflict prematurely. The satisfaction of seeing justice served, the meticulous orchestration come to fruition, was profound, yet there was also a deeper realization. Our victory was not just over Callista, but a reclamation of identity, autonomy, and self-respect long denied. I walked through the house, observing the subtle changes, the ease of my mother's laughter, the calm in our interactions, the absence of tension that had once dominated every corner. I understood then that the real triumph was emotional and psychological, the restoration of power balanced not through fear or aggression, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Callista, now isolated by her own miscalculations, had become a cautionary figure, a reminder of what happens when manipulation and coercion replace empathy and respect. I knew the coming days would require continued vigilance, but the foundation of control had shifted irreversibly. My mother and I shared moments of quiet reflection, her eyes meeting mine with a depth of gratitude and pride that words could scarcely capture. In those silent exchanges, I felt the culmination of months of struggle, the clarity of purpose, and the profound emotional connection that had guided every step of our journey. As night fell, I stood by the window, looking out at the calm darkness, contemplating the lessons learned and the power reclaimed. There was a serenity in knowing that justice, patience, and careful strategy could restore balance, heal wounds, and create a space where truth and integrity finally prevailed. And in that stillness, I allowed myself a quiet smile, a recognition that the journey had been as much about growth and resilience as it had been about victory, and that the house, the family, and our lives would never again be dominated by fear or control. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our home continued to evolve, shaped by the shifting dynamics and the lessons learned from the confrontation. Callista, once untouchable in her calculated control, had retreated into a quieter, more introspective presence, her previous dominance replaced by cautious reflection. My mother's newfound confidence radiated in every interaction, her authority unquestioned yet gracefully asserted, her sense of self restored after years of suppression. I took time to reflect on the journey we had endured, the careful planning, the emotional resilience, the patience required to navigate manipulation and deceit, and the courage needed to reclaim power without resorting to aggression. Each step had been a lesson in strategy, observation, and emotional intelligence, teaching me the importance of foresight, subtlety, and moral clarity. The documents, recordings, and carefully orchestrated exposures were not simply tools of revenge. They were instruments of truth, meticulously employed to restore balance and justice. In quiet moments, I observed my mother as she engaged with others confidently, her laughter genuine, her voice steady, her presence commanding respect rather than fear. I realized that the true victory was not the exposure of Callista alone, but the reclamation of dignity, autonomy, and emotional strength that had been denied for so long. Our relationship deepened, forged in the fire of adversity, strengthened by shared courage, and affirmed by the quiet satisfaction of justice achieved. I recognize the importance of empathy, patience, and moral fortitude in navigating complex interpersonal challenges, and the value of careful planning and restraint when confronting those who wield power unjustly. The house, once filled with tension and unspoken fear, now resonated with calm, laughter, and genuine connection. Callista's diminished presence served as a reminder of the consequences of deceit and manipulation, while my mother's empowerment symbolized the transformative potential of courage, strategy, and integrity. As I reflected on the entire journey, I understood that every calculated action, every observation, and every moment of patience had contributed not just to victory, but to personal growth, emotional clarity, and the restoration of a just and balanced household. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of closure, a story of struggle transformed into a narrative of triumph, resilience, and enduring empowerment, where truth and moral courage had finally prevailed, leaving behind a legacy of strength, dignity, and unshakable resolve that would guide us in the years to come. As weeks passed, the house settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, a delicate balance of reclaimed control and renewed trust. My mother's confidence had not only grown within the walls of our home but also in her dealings outside. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues now noticed the subtle transformation, the poise and authority she carried effortlessly. Callista, on the other hand, became a shadow of her former self, her influence waning and her presence cautious, a constant reminder of the consequences of overreaching ambition. I found myself reflecting on the entire journey more deeply than before, the painstaking patience required, the delicate strategies employed, the moments of tension and fear that tested my resolve, and the ultimate satisfaction of seeing truth and justice prevail. Yet, even in this period of calm, I remained vigilant, aware that power dynamics could shift quickly if left unchecked, and that maintaining balance required continual observation, empathy, and thoughtful intervention. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the walls in warm hues, I watched my mother move through the house with an ease and serenity I had rarely seen. The subtle gestures of everyday life, preparing dinner, speaking with neighbors, handling minor household issues, now carried a confidence and grace that reflected the emotional and strategic victories we had achieved together. Callista, sitting quietly in a corner, attempted no confrontation, her eyes reflecting acknowledgement rather than defiance, a tacit admission of the new order within the household. I realized that the story we had lived was not just about overcoming manipulation, but about growth, self-respect, and the reclamation of autonomy that had been stifled for years. Each interaction, each conversation, each small decision now carried the weight of lessons learned and boundaries established. Looking ahead, I felt a cautious optimism, the future uncertain, yes, but navigable with the strategies, patience, and emotional intelligence we had honed. The experience had reshaped not only the dynamics within the home, but also my understanding of resilience, empathy, and the subtle power of moral clarity. And as night fell, I allowed myself a quiet smile, knowing that while challenges would inevitably arise again, the foundation we had built, through courage, strategy, and unwavering resolve, would ensure that we were prepared, empowered, and unshakably ready for whatever came next. In that serene moment, I understood that our journey, though harrowing, had ultimately forged a legacy of strength, dignity, and enduring emotional insight that would guide us through the years ahead, a testament to patience, intelligence, and the quiet yet undeniable power of truth. In the quiet aftermath of our journey, I found myself reflecting on the intricate tapestry of emotions, strategies, and relationships that had shaped the months we had endured. Every moment of fear, every calculated risk, every tear shed in silence had contributed to the ultimate reclamation of our lives, our dignity, and our sense of self. Callista, once a symbol of control and intimidation, had been reduced to a cautionary figure, her attempts at manipulation dismantled by patience, observation, and careful orchestration. My mother's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The woman who had once moved cautiously through life, constrained by fear and uncertainty, now radiated confidence, authority, and a quiet yet undeniable power that inspired respect rather than obedience. I understood then that the battle had been about far more than revenge. It had been a journey toward empowerment, emotional clarity, and the restoration of balance within our lives. Each step, meticulously planned and executed, had taught me the profound importance of strategic patience, empathy, and moral integrity. The house, once suffused with tension and unspoken conflicts, now resonated with calm, laughter, and genuine connection. I could see the subtle ways in which trust had been rebuilt, relationships strengthened, and respect reestablished, not through force or intimidation, but through deliberate, intelligent, and ethically grounded actions. As I observed my mother interacting with the world around her, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief, recognizing the depth of her resilience and the power of our combined resolve. Callista's diminished presence served as a constant reminder of the consequences of deceit and ambition unchecked by empathy or morality, while the lessons we had learned provided a blueprint for navigating future challenges with wisdom and confidence. In the stillness of the evening, I allowed myself a moment of introspection, contemplating the intricate balance of power, the emotional journeys undertaken, and the ultimate triumph of truth, patience, and strategy. I realized that the story we had lived was as much about personal growth, emotional fortitude, and the reclamation of autonomy as it was about the exposure of manipulation and injustice. And in that reflective silence, I found a profound sense of closure. A story that began in fear and tension had transformed into a narrative of strength, empowerment, and enduring wisdom, leaving behind a legacy of courage, strategic insight, and the quiet yet unshakable power of truth. It was a journey that had tested our limits, strengthened our bonds, and affirmed the importance of patience, observation, and ethical clarity in the face of adversity, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of justice achieved through careful, deliberate, and morally grounded action. In the stillness of the evening, I allowed myself a moment of introspection, contemplating the intricate balance of power, the emotional journeys undertaken, and the ultimate triumph of truth, patience, and strategy. I realized that the story we had lived was as much about personal growth, emotional fortitude, and the reclamation of autonomy as it was about the exposure of manipulation and injustice. And in that reflective silence, I found a profound sense of closure. A story that began in fear and tension had transformed into a narrative of strength, empowerment, and enduring wisdom. The house, once heavy with shadows of control and deceit, now pulsed with warmth, laughter, and the quiet hum of resilience. Every challenge faced, every tear shed, every carefully calculated step had not only reclaimed what was lost but had forged an unbreakable bond between my mother and me, a bond built on trust, courage, and shared victory. As the moonlight streamed through the windows, casting silver patterns on the floor, I felt a quiet pride and peace that no adversity could shake. The journey had been long and grueling, but it had also been illuminating, a testament to the power of patience, strategy, and unwavering moral clarity. And in that luminous stillness, I knew this truth with absolute certainty: our story, though scarred with hardship, would forever stand as a reminder that courage, resilience, and unwavering integrity could triumph over even the darkest of manipulations, leaving behind not just justice, but hope, strength, and the promise of a future reclaimed.